Liar, plagiarist, socialist, adulteress, heretic. Martin Luther King was not a Christian, and he was certainly no faith hero in America. MLK was not a Christian. In fact, he was actually quite a bad man. You see, this is not conjecture. These are actually findings from his own writings, from scholarly papers, from those who knew him best, from some of his friends, those he traveled with most. I invite you to read for yourself the essays and other writings of MLK. Just make sure you rinse the malarkey out of your brain with the Bible and a good theology book afterwards. There are several reasons why Martin Luther King Jr. should not be revered as a historic Christian nor some faith figure in America. First, he was a flagrant heretic. Second, he was a socialist. Third, he was a dishonest student and a plagiarist. And lastly, fourth, he was maritally unfaithful and was an adulterous husband. First, he was a flagrant heretic. It is the case, in all actuality, that Martin Luther King Jr. denied a literal heaven and hell. From the Bodily Resurrection and Second Coming essay he wrote, quote, "Those who failed to achieve this immortal life were subjected to a physical place called hell in which they would suffer eternal misery by burning in a blazing fire. In modern times, we have come to see that such an eschatological thinking is by far incompatible with the modern scientific worldview. A physical heaven or a physical hell are inconceivable in a Copernican universe." MLK denied the virgin birth. In an essay on the papers of MLK concerning the virgin birth, in page 228, he says, quote, "We must admit that the evidence for the tenability of the virgin birth doctrine is too shallow to convince any objective thinker." End quote. We see this sentiment all throughout, this denial of the actual spiritual realities of Scripture. By the way, throughout these seminary papers in particular, he keeps dunking on some false sense of they explained it this way because they didn't have science, or maybe these weren't as learned men, or that this was a, quote, pre-scientific thought pattern, end quote, as he says in the virgin birth essay, and that it brought the resurrection and the virgin birth, and the supposed stupidity of these early Christian anti-intellectuals, i.e. the apostles, and how they only, quote, had been captivated by his magnetic power of personality. This led to the faith that he could never die, end quote, from page 229 of the virgin birth essay. The true irony here lies in the fact that while dunking on supposed misunderstood, under-linguistically equipped Jewish guys, he cannot seem to use correct grammar nor spelling in his master's level essays. He doesn't seem to have even given them a second read before he's published them or put them out. And not just that, he's not even using to correctly. He's spelling it T-O. The grammar seems to be very, very poor, as well as the spelling. And so you think, how are you going to specifically make an attempt at all of these guys for this under-scientific world of this less-than-ideal mindset? These guys kind of aren't as smart as we are in our higher source criticism, biblical criticism sort of deal. But I won't use grammar. But apparently I can't be borrowed to cite my sources or, I don't know, actually read my paper again before I submit it. But we shall continue on. He denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ. In a quote from his own autobiography, quote, "The lessons which I was taught in Sunday school were quite in the fundamentalist line. None of my teachers ever doubted the infallibility of the Scriptures." The indication is that he does, as the quote goes on. I'll start the quote again. Quote, "Most of them were unlettered and had never heard of biblical criticism." Yeah, apparently that's why they were poor at what they did, just because they hadn't heard of biblical criticism. Next, quote, "Naturally, I accepted the teachings as they were being given to me. I never felt any need to doubt them. At least at the time, I didn't. I guess I accepted biblical studies uncritically until I was about 12 years old. But this uncritical attitude could not last long, for it was contrary to the very nature of my being. I had always been the questioning and precocious type. At the age of 13, I shocked my Sunday school teacher by shocked my Sunday school class by denying the bodily resurrection of Jesus. From the age of 13 on, doubts began to spring forth unrelenting. At the age of 15, I entered college, and more I could see a gap between what I had learned in Sunday school and what I was learning in college. This conflict continued until I studied a course in Bible, in which I came to see that behind the legends and myths of the book were many profound truths with which one could not escape." So to stop for a second, the Bible is a book of myths where it has underlying truth. No, that's not a Christian principle. This is all story, and it's just whatever the truth I glean from it comes out. Christ says he is the truth, the way and the truth. And I don't think he means that in some way that's so broad and metaphysical that as long as you walk somewhat according to my way. He makes claims to exclusivity. But let's go on. Beginning the quote again, "As stated above, my college training, especially the first 2 years, brought many doubts into my mind. It was at this period that the shackles of fundamentalism were removed from my body. This is why, when I came to Crozer, I could accept the liberal interpretation with relative ease." We see that these doubts aren't just being answered. He's saying that fundamentalism is what the shackle is. Now, I am not a fundamentalist Baptist Christian, as many probably here interacted with him in his life. I am a Presbyterian. In fact, I'm a conservative Presbyterian in America. But to say that the thing that shackled him were fundamental beliefs, it's not fundamentalism to believe that Christ rose from the dead. That's basic Christian teaching. That's not just some dogma. Next, in his Second Coming essay, quote, "It is obvious that most 20th century Christians must frankly and flatly reject any view of a physical return of Christ. To hold such a view would mean denying a Copernican universe, for there can be no physical return unless there is a physical place from which to return. In its literal form, this belief belongs to a pre-scientific world which we cannot accept." This is from his Second Coming bodily essay. If you deny the resurrection, if you deny the physical resurrection, if you deny that Christ is actually coming back, you are not a Christian. Above all else, overtly, he denied that Jesus was God. MLK on Humility and Divinity of Christ. In this essay, he writes, quote, "We may find the divinity of Christ not in his substantial unity with God, but in his filial consciousness and in his unique dependence upon God. It was his felling of absolute dependence on God, as Schleiermacher would say, that made him divine. It is the achievement of a man who has, as nearly as we can tell, completely opened his life to the influence of the divine spirit." That's heresy. This is some Christ consciousness mumbo jumbo. It's the achievement of man. That Jesus Christ achieved divinity? Absolutely not. This is adoptionism, the idea that Jesus became divine, and then God gives him the stamp that Jesus wasn't eternally past. It sort of softens into Arianism as well, but no. Jesus was and is absolutely divine. Jesus did not exist separate from the Trinity or just become a man and then he achieves divine status. Absolutely not. Not that, as quote, "as nearly as we can tell, completely open his life to the influence of the divine spirit." That's what Jesus was. That's what it was all about. He just had to open himself to the cosmos. I think not. Actually, the church would think not, the Bible would think not, and historic Christianity would think not. But let's go on. Quote in the same essay, "The Orthodox attempt to explain the divinity of Jesus in terms of an inherent metaphysical substance within him seems to me quite inadequate. To say that the Christ, whose example of limb we are to bid to follow, is divine is in an ontological sense, is actually harmful and detrimental. Is divine in an ontological sense is actually harmful and detrimental." The idea that there is actually a metaphysical reality to the Christ, that there is actually a divine nature, a human nature, that's readily deniable, as he'll say. Well, let's read that quote. "The Orthodox view of the divinity of Christ is, in my mind, quite readily denied." Well, then we will deny that you are a Christian. This is simple stuff. This isn't that he holds some fringe view that I'm neglecting. MLK is not a Christian. Further, his conclusion statement in the essay, quote, "This divine quality or this unity with God was not something thrust upon Jesus from above, but it was a definite achievement through the process of moral struggle and self-abnegation," he says. It was the moral struggle of Jesus that made him divine. It was that Jesus was really like, I want to sin, but I'll deny myself sin, and that's what will make me divine. No, it is that in proving himself to be the sinless, spotless Lamb, Christ is the divine, absolutely, but he shows us in that he defeats sin in the grave because he's the perfect sacrifice needed. He's our substitutionary atonement before God. It's not that he ascends to holiness to show us how to be holy. It's that he lives the holy life, certainly to show us how to be holy, but to also die the perfect, fulfilling death, raise again physically as he said he would, carrying with him death to keys, Hades, to all of that would dare to oppress him. He's literally God incarnate. And absolutely, it's not through achieving a moral good that Jesus becomes God. Jesus is God, and as such does good. And then, if you needed more, he even denied the cross was the atonement for sin. Listen to this on an essay that starts at the view of the cross. This is the essay, and I'll have a link to it as well. In the next place, this is the quote, "If Christ by his life and death paid the full penalty of sin, there is no valid ground for repentance or moral obedience as a condition of forgiveness. The debt is paid, the penalty is exact, and there is consequently nothing to forgive." How does this flies in the face of Paul? Right? That the idea that just because you're saved by grace, like by no means you should keep sinning. This is the whole sentiment that though you are saved, that you are justified, that in your sanctification, Christ is still saying you need to do good things because you have been called to be a good people, not because it saves you, but because this is what's righteous and it's right for you to do. It's how you love God, it's how you keep his law. It's not how you earn, but he's not even making that argument. He's going through and saying that because the penalty of sin is paid, well, there's no forgiveness to be had. Then where can we run with that? MLK, can we say, Martin, well, I guess I go over here and I cheated on my wife, and but God has forgiven me, and there's nothing to be forgiven for, and the death is paid the full penalty of sin, and so because of that, no, we don't say that because Christ paid the penalty of sin, that gives us license to sin. It's exactly what Paul wrote against. So all of this confesses that from his own mouth, from the horse's mouth, so to speak, MLK was not a believer. So he is certainly no faith leader to be renowned. We can't just decide that we want to regard him well on MLK Day. Next, it's worth noting, he was a socialist. In a letter to Coretta Scott, the woman he'd go on to marry and be adulterous towards, we'll get to that. Quote, "So today capitalism has outlived its usefulness. I'm not a political channel," that's the end of the quote, "I'm not a political channel out the gate that I just want to commentate on politics all the time, but I think we have to talk through logistically if we're going to revere King, some like American archetypal figure. He's just a Christian and capitalist and all these things that I kind of hear spewed around, certainly in my local context. I look and I say, no. I'd say that King rejects at points portions of communism where he goes, I'm not so far as to be a communist, but I like socialism. And I think that's something we have to look at. And he tries to paint it in actually a Christian lens rather than being the church should be charitable towards the world, that there should be a national ownership of things. And so I'll get in. I'll let his quotes speak. I won't try to slander. This is what he said. I'm not slandering. He told her that he was, quote, in the same letter, more socialistic in his economic theory than capitalistic. Okay. Now, quote, "But I would certainly welcome the day to come when there will be a nationalization of industry." This is a socialist dogma here, that the nation would control industry. And that's something that is pertinent. To say that this is an American figure, we have to look at some things. And I'm not saying that to be socialist is to be absolutely in all ways anathema. But what I am saying is that it is not the moral worldview. Socialism hurts people. In fact, it kills people, along with communism. And I think frankly he's dishonest to go, I'm going to get away from communism, and that's not something that exists and for me, and it's some immoral thing. But that socialism is all good and well, even though that its logical end, I think, is effectively communism. But let's go on. I'd say the least important of these points, and it's still egregious, is character, I feel. He was a dishonest plagiarist. I debated whether to say plagiarizer or plagiarist. I would guess plagiarizer is probably somebody who does it once, but plagiarist is somebody who makes a habit of it, and I would say he does just that. You can look at detailed portions of this in the papers that have been submitted himself by his wife, or some New York Times articles. You can even look on the Wikipedia page, you can find it, but specifically the likes of Claiborne Carson's and his analysis. The MLK papers, right, to give you a little history here, are donated by his wife, Coretta, to Stanford. And this forms the committee known as the King Papers Project. And they're going to go through here, and they want it to kind of be something that they can put out. That it can be, honestly, something good for King. I mean, that's why his wife submitted it. It's posthumous, right? So in the 80s, the staff notices there's some issues with King's doctoral dissertation at Boston University. This is titled A Comparison of the Conception of God in the Thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman, or Weeman, I'm not sure. These issues turned out to be large, blatant, verbatim plagiarism of a man named Jack Boozer, that's who was borrowed from, who was a graduate from Boston University 3 years prior to the writing of the essay. In fact, the leader of the committee, I'd say, or at least one of the major heads of this group, the King's Paper Project, he comes out, and I'll link this as well, Claiborne Carson, and he says, instances, quote, instances of textual appropriation can be seen in his earlier extant writings as well as his dissertation. The pattern is also noticeable in his speeches and sermons throughout his career. In a paper from Morehouse College in 1948, Dr. King wrote, quote, if we are not careful, our colleges will produce a group of closed-minded, unscientific, illogical propagandists consumed with immoral acts. Be careful, brethren. Be careful, teachers. If only his university and MLK himself would have listened to his own advice, maybe he wouldn't have been consumed with immoral acts himself. Case in point, he was maritally unfaithful and a sexually promiscuous husband. The FBI began tapping King's phones in the spring or potentially summer of 1963 and later planted bugs in hotel rooms where he stayed when he was on the road. You see, initially, the FBI was concerned about communism, or specifically, namely, King being a communist, because of his group affiliation with the SCLC, which stands for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And now the issue here was that there were known communists in the party. And so the idea was to say, or in the group, I should say. And so it was King a communist? So if we give him some sort of platform to talk about civil rights at all, if this happens, what are we going to do about it? Not safe for work warning here. Tapes and subsequently discovered letters did not catch him on communism, but the tapes did catch constant sexual encounters with a myriad of women, even multiple at once. Potentially, groupies, prostitutes, and even orgies occurred. Although King himself is not here to answer for these cases and to give a defense for himself, and though there is a chance they are false and meant to be slanderous, it seems the prevailing consensus that he was absolutely unfaithful to his wife. Though to what extent, that's what's under debate here. It seems to be that those closest to him regarded him as weak to women and often in inappropriate relationships even after speaking engagements, as women would frequently pass up their hotel keys or their cell phone numbers, this sort of deal. You can see in The Walls Come Tumbling Down by Ralph David Abernathy for details, Bearing the Cross by David Garrow, and Parting the Waters, America in the King Years, 1954 to 63 by Taylor Branch, in the FBI records at the time. I will make reference to these in the video, but I also have links in the description to many of the works I'm discussing throughout. So, having one thing right, or one particularly notable good idea, does not make you a great man of God. We've been quick to paint with a wide brush that Martin Luther King Jr. was one of the holiest men in our nation, when in reality, he was a moral disaster, and not a Christian, let alone some faith leader. What I share with you is not a conspiracy. It is historical literacy. We cannot raise MLK up as a Christian hero when he was no Christian at all. 2 John 1 verse 9 says, whoever transgresses and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ does not have God. He who abides in the doctrine of Christ has both the Father and the Son. Look before to what we just talked about. I mean, fast forward the video. MLK was a heretic. He didn't have some theological deviancies from me where I want to poke fun at him. We hold him as a Christian hero when we should do no such thing. Because we know this, that whoever transgresses like MLK and does not abide in the doctrine of Christ, namely that Christ is God, they do not have God, this verse says. So, sure, Martin, we will do exactly what you ask. We won't judge you on the color of your skin, but by the content of your character. And your character is sinful trash. You are not of Christ, and we should not revere you as a national Christian hero. I pity the Christian who praises you, and I ask him to stop. This is Gabe Holcomb with Reformed Reason. I'll see you next time.